Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. It's Friday, October 18th, 12:02. So we're only 2 minutes behind, and we are enjoying all the perks of the ever-evolving world of Zoom. It's really great to be here with you all today. I see there's about 12 of you who have joined, and I'm sure there'll be people who join and depart over the course of this next 45 minutes to an hour. But I'm really delighted you're all here. In case you're not sure what you've showed up for today, you are at the second installment of the Suicide Justice series for the current academic year at the University of Toronto, 2024 to 2025. This is a really important series that's sponsored by the Critical Health and Social Action Lab, which is a Canada Foundation for Innovation, Innovation and Research Center founded at the University of Toronto in 2020. We've developed this series really in conversation with an emerging eclectic group of scholars from around the world who are writing in conversation with critical ideas and social theory in relationship to the issue of suicide and suicidality. This series gets its namesake from a scholar from University of California in Los Angeles, UCLA, Kristen Carden, who wrote a really important article a few years ago now in 2022 called Suicide Justice, where she works with the adoption of Indigenous feminist research methodologies to really unsettle, to reconsider, and to recenter the work of suicide prevention and a number of other genres of responses to suicide beyond the logics of prevention as foremost critical concerns of justice, questions that are deeply connected and tethered to projects of racial, gender, sexual, economic, and other forms of justice. And she draws on the work of Eve Sedgwick's reparative reading method to really reconsider and reframe the work of both research and praxis as it revolves and engages and is necessarily entangled with responding to a world where suicide exists. And where suicide asks us to think very deeply and significantly about what it means to be among the living, responding to this reality. And I'm really delighted today to introduce to you someone whose work I've been reading for the last couple of years and who I think is bringing an incredibly important set of ideas and practices to this conversation. That is Professor Emily Krebs at Fordham University, who's going to be sharing today a presentation called Queering the Desire to Die, Care, Intimacy, and Living with Suicidality. Professor Krebs, I actually came to know your work initially through Twitter, which seems like a relic of a time long ago. Now I guess X and whatever, we could just call it like the propaganda machine at this point. But yeah, it was once upon a time, Twitter was a place where you kind of stumbled into relationships across vast regions of the world with people who were thinking and acting and exploring ideas. And I was really thrilled and excited to see the kinds of epistemic and ethical interventions you're offering that really call us to think about what queering and abolitionist thought might do to transform conversations around suicidality. And so it's a real delight and a privilege to welcome you to the Suicide Justice series today. And we're really looking forward to your presentation. And so with that, I'll hand it over to you. If you have questions, for those of you who are participating today during the conversation, you can enter them into the Q&A box over the course of the presentation today. Those of you who are multitaskers, you can vote on questions that you feel like are super appropriate, and you can maybe not support questions that you don't think are super appropriate, and that's okay. And I can read that, and maybe that will help inform how I facilitate the Q&A later on. There's a number of you who are here who I know and who are part of our lab who I'll invite to join us on screen at a point in the conversation later today. But for those of you who are here for the first time, welcome, and I look forward to connecting with you in the future. On that note, I will pass it over to Professor Krebs.
Thank you very much. I'm so thrilled to be here. Yes, I've met a lot of people who do critical suicidology work through running my mouth on Twitter. now X, which is an interesting space currently, but is one where I have been able to connect with lots of other people doing work around suicide in pretty radical ways. Again, my name is Emily Krebs. I also sometimes go by my first initial. You can call me either. And I'll start today's talk with just a quick overview of where we're going. I'll talk to you about my academic and personal background, kind of why I do this work, and then talk about the current state of suicide research and where my work kind of fits into that. And the project that I'll be presenting is called Queering the Desire to Die. And it's based on an article that is published in the Journal of Homosexuality. I'm happy to send it to anyone who's interested, but this work, it kind of expands upon that since it's now 2 years old. I'll also talk about applying all of this outside academia and what that means, because as much as I love theoretical innovation, at the end of the day, I'm concerned with making concrete changes toward a more livable world, because I think that's what we need when thinking about suicide. Before I get too far, I want to offer a quick content warning. Of course, you know it's going to be about suicide based on the title, but it does include explicit comments about suicide methods, abuse in psychiatric facilities, police violence, sexual violence, and some other traumatic topics. So please feel free to mute me, step away as you need, and I invite you all to check in with each other after the presentation as well. You can also reach out to me for additional resources if that's helpful. So before we talk about my work and where I want it to go, I think you need to know a bit about how I got here. So I'm currently an assistant professor of health and culture and the co-director of disability studies at Fordham University in New York City. Prior to this, I got my PhD at the University of Utah and my master's and bachelor's degrees at the University of Denver. All of my degrees are in communication studies. And you might ask why communication if I research health and culture and social justice. And honestly, I've asked myself that many times too. And sometimes my professors ask me the same question. Ultimately, communication studies is very interdisciplinary. A lot of people think of it as strategic communications or journalism, but it's much bigger than that. Most of my education is rooted in critical cultural studies, which is explicitly concerned with power and identity and social justice. I cite mostly work outside of communication studies, sociology, public health, cultural studies, feminist literature. But I think the communication angle is important because how we communicate about suicide has major impacts on how it gets addressed. So why do I study suicide? This is a really frequent question, especially for people who are kind of nervous about this topic because they want to know how I picked such a cheerful and uplifting topic to spend my life researching. And the answer is pretty simple, personal experience. I was 9 years old when I thought about suicide for the first time, and it terrified me. 2 decades later, roughly, I've been kind of varying degrees of suicidal my entire life. Things peaked during my first year at university, but I didn't tell anyone. And in fact, the only time I ever mentioned it to anyone was when I was 9 and first experienced suicidal ideation. And I was told that if I kept talking like that, I'd be taken to a hospital. And I knew I really didn't want that because I'd seen a lot of movies that involved psych wards. So I just never spoke about it again, even when I really, really needed help, when I had a plan and means to make it happen. Fortunately, I got through it alone somehow. And then during my second year at university, I had this really fantastic professor who opened me to learning about vulnerability and compassion and the power of telling difficult stories. And after spending about a year and a half working with her and seeing her not just talk about the dark sides of her own life, but also turning those things into research projects, I decided that it might be safe to kind of come out as suicidal, if you will. So I wrote my undergraduate honors thesis as an autoethnography about suicidality and perfectionism, which was incredibly scary. And I was convinced that I was going to get reported immediately, but my mentor handled it really beautifully. And it was really encouraging. She helped me want to write and talk and research suicide more. And it did, as I did all of those things, suicide became less scary and I was less afraid of myself. I also found this book, which you might be familiar with, that became kind of like a Bible to me because thinking about critical suicidology and critical perspectives gave me new ways of thinking and talking about something that I spent my whole life thinking I could never think or talk about, really. And that's why I knew I wanted to pursue suicide research and advocacy. And in fact, this book was co-edited by one of the fantastic speakers that you have coming later in March to talk to you, Jennifer White. So really, really fantastic group of people, and I'm proud to be part of this little series. Since all of this went down when I was in my late teens, early 20s, I've published several articles and book chapters in MAD studies and critical suicidology. And I'm really fortunate that I work at a university where this type of work is supported. I actually disclosed my suicidality during the job interview, and they still hired me. And here I am doing this work today. So I'm really grateful for that space. So to get started, I'm going to kind of lay some groundwork on the state of suicide and suicide research today. As background, my research is based in the United States, and I'm aware that this lab is based in Canada and that some people may be joining from other locations as well. So I've tried to kind of update these stats, but that context might be slightly different. Currently, suicide is the 11th leading cause of death in the US. It was 10th forever, but it was bumped from that slot by COVID-19. It's currently the 13th leading cause of death in Canada. And interestingly, while suicide rates are rising in the US, they're falling slightly in Canada. I don't know how to describe that or give you the reason behind it. It could just be about what the numbers that get reported, but something interesting to think about. Only about 4% of suicide attempts actually end in death, but over 1 million people are attempting in the US every year. So this is impacting a huge amount of people. And of course, most people who think about suicide never attempt. So the scale in terms of the people who are actually experiencing suicidality is massive. Despite what a lot of people seem to be claiming, there's actually no scientific proof that suicide is caused by any sort of biological or chemical pathology. But we still have medical research kind of reigning supreme in the area of suicidology. The vast majority of suicide research, and especially what's funded by major government agencies, is also quantitative and is focused on identifying risk factors. Quantitative research is kind of the explicit gold standard in the field. And in fact, the most comprehensive international suicidology journal declared in 2011 that they would prioritize publishing quantitative studies. And the editor, Thomas Joyner's words were, "Without this, genuine progress in suicide prevention is distinctly unlikely." Of the 110 articles published in that journal following this announcement, every single article was quantitative, and only 2 studies were mixed method that had small qualitative portions. So we're missing a huge part of research here. As a qualitative researcher, my heart hurts a little bit hearing that. But the bigger problem here is that in all of these articles, suicide and suicidal people were framed as problems in need of fixing. None of this research took on a strengths-based approach or framed suicidal desire as anything other than this worst-case scenario that we have to eliminate. So in my work, I'm following this long line of critical suicidologists who are trying to think about suicide differently and to understand it in ways that are more complex, and notably in ways that center the voices of suicidal people. Because of the kind of epistemic violence that surrounds people that we call mentally ill or mad, which is the notion that these people can't possibly know or understand their own experiences, the voices of suicidal people are rarely centered in suicide research, and often they're not just not centered, they're just not included at all. So in my view, and the view of, I think, a lot of people who are probably watching this presentation, we have to flip the script. We need to center the voices of suicidal people if we want to address suicidality in meaningful ways. So in the spirit of kind of centering suicidal people's voices, I'm going to start with an excerpt from a poem that's called The Bible Belt by queer South Asian poet Alok Vadmenon. They said, "These days, I have all of the theory to know why they would have called this a suicide instead of a murder, to rinse their own hands of the blood, as if we hate ourselves because it's our choice. as if we kill ourselves because we wanted to and not because they told us to, as if we were not following their prophecy. A lot of scholars have addressed what they call the things lost in the naming of a death as a suicide. And as Alok highlights, suicide is often the result of various intersections of colonialism, capitalism, racism, queerphobia, and all of these get hidden beneath these neat claims of psychiatric error. You just had a problem in your brain, not a problem in the world. And medicalization in this sense hides what Huar calls the right to maim, which is this form of strategic and debilitating targeting of subjects who threaten the white heteronormative state. And in many ways, I argue that suicide is the ultimate manifestation of that state maiming. Gus Dieppe calls it soul murder because it keeps the hands of the oppressors clean. And that's what Alok's poem was talking about. The fact that for them, suicidality is this experience of murder that other people are perpetrating upon them, but the language of suicide hides that. So to think about all of the dominant processes that people encounter when being forced to stay alive in the face of all of this violence and pain, I offered in my work a new theoretical framework, which I coined the term compulsory vivation. I use this term to label the ideology that undergirds a lot of involuntary care practices as forces of state maiming. And I define it as the forced desire to strive toward normativity and capitalist productivity as the sole path toward survival and success and happiness. Compulsory vivation backs suicide prevention programs around the world, which rely on this overwhelming logic of suicide deaths as individual failures and tragedies, not the result of some sort of normative violence. Thinking of Puar's work on a symbolic level, keeping people alive through compulsory vivation also allows the state to display suicidal people as inherently and internally damaged. So keeping them alive is almost a warning sign for others who don't conform to these kind of hegemonic standards of normativity. So we think in this lens about, for example, carceral care practices, which I'll define later, as part of this kind of state violence against marginalized people. So what does compulsory vivation look like in practice? It functions through a wide range of mechanisms. And the first one is the fact that when someone admits that they're suicidality or that they are suicidal, the most common response is for us to involve medical personnel or law enforcement, regardless of consent. We're all kind of given this message that you cannot address suicidality by yourself. Professionals need to do it. In fact, most schools and care facilities and other systems, higher ed included, across the US and Canada and much of the world, have mandatory reporting policies. And through these, staff members are legally required to report incidents in which people share thoughts of self-harm or suicide. And if someone discloses that they're planning to kill themselves and a staff member keeps that plan a secret, in many US states, that person can actually be charged with manslaughter. So it is indeed a crime in many places not to engage in that mandatory reporting. And before we get too far, I want to acknowledge that some people are grateful for mandatory reporters. This process has saved lives. However, it also harms and kills people, and we have to engage with that as well. Many people considering suicide view reporting policies as deterrents to disclosure. And this is in part because the entity that responds to these reports and does welfare checks is law enforcement. And as you all know, engaging with police is pretty dangerous for a wide range of marginalized groups. And in particular, people of color with assumed mental illness, which if someone has called you for a suicide check-in, they're going to assume you're mentally ill. These people of color with mental illnesses are much more likely than their peers to be killed by police in all situations, including ones where there has been no crime committed, like this. So even in a welfare check, they're more likely to be killed by police. We call this moment where police go and do this welfare check a non-consensual active rescue. And that is just the first in this long line of dehumanizing practices. ultimately, what that rescue does is it places people in forced hospitalization. And mental hospitals are structured much like prisons, which echoes this long history of the criminalization of suicide and mental illness. In fact, suicide was illegal in many countries around the world, and it still is in 20 of them. There are actually a long history of punishing people who died by suicide or attempted suicide in legal means, which I'm happy to talk about later in Q&A. Once we're looking at mental hospitals, even in contemporary times, containment over care is the clear norm. We've got confinement chambers, bars, straitjackets, bed restraints, fences barring you from going to the outside world. And much like prisoners, patients are also forced to take things like medication and food and liquid into their bodies, regardless of whether or not they consent to consuming them. The infamous one is called booty juice, which is an injection of sedatives into the behind whenever a patient acts up or resists this involuntary care. Patients are also stripped of their clothing, phones, internet access, contact with outsiders. And while all of this is meant to be a life-preserving treatment, people have this rhetoric where, yes, this sucks, but if it saves a life, it saves a life. The problem is it doesn't. Involuntary care is clearly violent, but it actually has lethal consequences even after it's ended. In the week following release from involuntary psychiatric care, suicide risk skyrockets. Studies have showed that people are over 100 times more likely to die by suicide after release than they were going in. And interestingly, the United Nations and World Health Organization have both explicitly condemned non-consensual psychiatric care, but many countries, including both of ours, continue to use it as this gold standard of suicide prevention. Now, people make a lot of jokes about carceral care practices online. Often the term grippy socks vacation is the euphemism used for involuntary psychiatric care. And it is a little bit funny, but that humor is a coping mechanism. And as disability activist Leah Lakshmi explains, people's fear of accessing care didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of generations and centuries where needing care meant being locked up, losing your human rights, and being subject to abuse. So after all of this cheerful information, what can we do about it? Can we frame suicide in positive ways that evade compulsory evasion? What does that look like? And what would it mean for suicide prevention? Do we need prevention or do we need something else? In this project, I blend queer theory, disability studies, and health communication to offer a pretty radical framework that I think helps us think about suicide away from compulsory evasion. And that is that we should think about suicide as a queer desire. Not queer as in gay, but queer as in anti-normative. In this sense, it's probably the queerest of all desires because of its near universal abject status. Desiring death is one of the most perverse things that most normative ideologies and groups can imagine. It's pretty much universally condemned around the world. This framing of suicide as a queer desire is not intended to encourage suicide, but rather to demedicalize it and in turn repoliticize the desire to die as a normal response to living in these societies that are actively harming marginalized, non-normative, non-dominant groups. So the world is actually less habitable for these people. It also, this framing does not reject the concept of mental illness playing a role here. It's more about linking those experiences of mental illness to sociopolitical trauma and violence. And to me, what is most important is that thinking about the desire to die as queer allows us to think about care differently. Because if we address suicidality as a desire, that invites us to think about healing as requiring intimacy and deep connection, not locking suicidal people away. To ground this very queer framing of suicide, I will give you some key terms and a little map in terms of queer theory and disability studies to kind of back my thinking of how I got to this framework. This study was initially published in a special issue of the Journal of Homosexuality on queer relationalities. So I used these three forms of queer relationality to guide my thinking. I focus specifically on two disability justice concepts: access, intimacy, and care webs. And these terms refer to the relationships that are rooted in kind of deep knowing, in which disability and madness and illness become sites of connection and intimacy, as opposed to sites of isolation. So in these systems, healers themselves can be, and often are, mad, sick, crip, and in need of healing. And this framework directly opposes this kind of dominant medical, patriarchal, capitalist core of Western biomedicine, where we have this agentic patient that heals while a passive patient is healed. Instead, it's this kind of deep anti-hierarchical mutuality in sickness and healing, where people offer what they can, when they can, and also accept care from others in return. That interdependence is really important, because I know a lot of us are good to give care, but struggle to accept it. So these frameworks also push us to acknowledge the power of interdependence. Both of these frameworks and their authors are expanding on Audre Lorde's queer conceptualization of erotics, not as a sexual term, but as sharing deeply in pursuits, especially critiques of injustice with others. So critiquing oppression within suicide and suicide prevention is essentially what I frame as a type of non-sexual erotic exercise when we're thinking about access, intimacy, and care webs. So to define resistance against compulsory vivation, I offered another term. Academics love to make up terms, so I do too. This term is queer vivation. Queer vivation offers opportunities to imagine and create worlds in which suicide is not just fixable by adherence to dominant norms, nor is it even a failure in need of curing at all. Instead, queer relationalities like access, intimacy, and care webs, which are essentially queer family units, can open spaces of healing, spaces where suicidal people are not prevented from killing themselves via violences like involuntary hospitalization, but are rather invited to continue living in the more habitable worlds that people create together. So queer vivation isn't just about making people live, it's about making livable spaces and livable worlds for these people. I know that this is a lot of theory and a lot of terms that is kind of getting away from the goal of centering the voices of suicidal people. So I'm going to offer some case studies that illustrate queer vivation in the second half of this talk. And these case studies come from a broader project, which was my dissertation, where I analyzed 140 narratives shared by suicide attempt survivors about their experiences. This was a huge data pool with I think it was over 1,000 single space pages of data. And all of the narratives are publicly available online through the website Live Through This, which is still up if you want to access it. They're all curated by Desiree L. Stage, who is a suicide survivor, social worker, and mad justice advocate herself. After I downloaded all of these stories, I engaged in Sarah Tracy's iterative analysis procedures, guided by narrative analysis as outlined by some key health comm scholars, Lynn Harder and Jill Yamasaki. And the iterative approach of qualitative analysis that Tracy offers is really key, because it allows me to dip between meanings that are emerging in the data, so the stories themselves, but also outside literature and theory. So a great way to blend my own thinking and the theories of thinkers that I'm engaging with alongside what the data is showing and what people are telling in their stories. So in analyzing the survivors' narratives, I further defined queer vivation as having these three core elements. One of them is conscientization as a form of healing. The next one is centering suicidal people's embodied knowledge. And the third is reclaiming interdependence as central to human life and survival. And to avoid getting this to be too theoretical, let's dive in deeper and give some examples. So in the context of suicide, conscientization refers to the process through which people become aware of psychiatric oppression and justice movements that can help them want to continue living in line with queer vivation. So in my own story, conscientization was finding this book and being able to think about suicide in critical ways. One way that people find healing through this is by framing the desire to die as a normal response to external marginalization. So in this frame, staying alive is a form of resistance against normativity and violences that come with it. Conscientization also involves community building and connecting with other mad or suicidal individuals. So in the following, these are direct quotes from suicide attempt survivor narratives, and these are actual photos of the people who are speaking, because on the website Live Through This, all of the narrators must agree to be photographed, which is an interesting challenge that we can talk about later. But these are the real full names and photographs of these people sharing their stories. Suicide survivor Jess Stolman Rainey explains her experience with conscientization as a tool for healing. She said, all these diagnoses, all these medications, there was nothing that helped me feel better. It seemed like in this whole medication process, nobody gave a shit about me feeling better either. They were just like, okay, here's a symptom. We're going to just medicate that away instead of thinking about what are the things that you're okay with managing? What are the things you're not? Activism, I feel, is the real thing that changed my life. Like taking women's studies courses and being involved in that space and feeling like I had community and the things I did mattered. I wasn't wrong about all this pain and injustice in the world that I had been experiencing my whole life or knowing was there my whole life. I wasn't wrong about that. This stuff was real and deserved attention. In her story, Jess talks about conscientization being a turning point for her because it brought a new explanation for her suicidality and linked it to injustice. That link also linked her to others and made her feel less alone in her desires. And in fact, today, she's the director of program development at Rocky Mountain Crisis Partners, which is a 24/7 community-based anti-carceral crisis intervention org in Colorado. You can find a lot of her work online, and she's run wonderful things that she's writing and sharing with the world. Another person who is continuing to write and speak about suicide publicly is Leah Harris. Leah describes their struggles with psychiatry and how they found healing through joining activist circles. So this healing began with, again, like me, finding a copy of a book called for them Taking Back Prozac in their university bookstore. And after reading the book, they reached out to one of the authors who engaged with them via email and cued them to join the movement of mental health activism. Leah says, I got in touch with mental health activists. I started advocating with them. Now I've really been focusing on more systems change. I've kind of taken on this suicide prevention industrial complex a bit by trying to bring the voices of people who have used these services and gone through these experiences to say, yes, we are experts too. I really respect you. I respect that you have an MD, you have a PhD, you have an LCSW, whatever you have in terms of letters behind your name, but we are experts by experience. Today, Leah offers trauma-informed trainings, curricula, and facilitations related to suicide care around the country. And you can find their writing in the blog called Mad in America, which is a fantastic resource as well. Leah's story also leans into the second tenet of queervivation, which was centering suicidal people's experiential knowledge. So witnessing and validating suicide narratives is in itself an exercise of healing, because when we witness each other's pain, we feel more seen and connected to the world and each other. And beyond that, story sharing within care webs can help people share their experiences as tools that guide broader social justice resistance. In this frame, suicidal people are the greatest sources of knowledge to help reform sociocultural systems and policies that promote suicide deaths. This is a really simple concept of leadership by the most impacted. Get the people in the room and have them lead when they're the ones who know this best. Suicide survivor Veronica von Mader explains this concept via metaphor. She said, when one person in the community is sick, it's because the community itself is sick. The sick person is the canary. In the early mining days, they would take a canary down the mine shaft, and if the canary didn't sing, it's because there were gases down there that were toxic and the canary had died. I think that people with illness of any sort are sort of a canary for our community. Time and time again, it's proven itself true. People with mental illness were lacking some sort of resource in their community, some sort of ability to meet their needs. In Veronica's metaphor, suicidal and mentally ill people are important signals for communities to rethink their values and how their resources impact members of their community. So later in this story, though, which I think is very important, Veronica calls for people not to wait for the canary to die, to take action. In other words, we can't wait for suicide death. We have to take steps now to keep the canaries singing. Witnessing these types of experiential accounts is particularly important, I would argue, for people of color living with the desire to die, because suicide is often whitewashed as a health issue that does not discriminate. But that's really not accurate. Suicide survivor Angela Ussery, who is a Black woman who's dealt with suicidality from a young age, explained the impact of racism on the care that she was given. I was put on Seroquel, about 800 milligrams, which is absolutely horrible since the standard dose is 300. African Americans, unfortunately, are usually dosed much more highly than whites. I fell over in the streets, and the doctor decided to lower it to 600 milligrams. My physicians saw African Americans as being more aggressive and more dangerous. Even if the symptoms presented by a white person were the same, they tended to dose Black people higher. And while Angela is speaking for herself here, what she's speaking about is a very real phenomenon. We have lots of documentation that shows that clinicians in emergency rooms and inpatient psych wards consistently prescribe higher doses of antipsychotics to Black people. And this echoes this long stereotypical view of the Black body as a site of danger in biomedicine. And this combines with negative views of mentally ill people as menacing to society and to form this kind of compounding oppression for suicidal people of color, particularly Black people, who become the kind of ultimate enemies of compulsory ovation. We see this via historical mass sterilizations of women of color, medical experimentation on Black people, like the Tuskegee syphilis experiment in the US, and lots of other eugenic moves. So these issues are all related to compulsory ovation and its white normative core. The final tenet of queer vivation that I'll talk about today is reclaiming interdependence. And this one is wonderful to talk about and much, much harder to do in practice if you're anything like me. But this final tenet resists the notion that suicide is a private matter that needs to be kept behind the walls of psychiatric wards. Instead, healing must be this community-driven undertaking. So access intimacy in the form of cohabitation, either long-term or just in moments of crisis, is one way that people can create more habitable worlds on a small scale. Here, intimacy means access to deep connection that fights one of the most significant risk factors for suicide, which is isolation. Suicide survivor Mashuk Jean, a trans playwright and performer in California, describes a moment of access intimacy on, of all things, a first date. He says, "When I first met my partner, one of the first things she said about my scars was she looked at my wrist, she took my wrist and looked at it and said, I think she even touched it. I'm sorry you were in so much pain." No one had ever said that before. There was no judgment in it, and I think it was because her sister had been cutting for a little while, so she understood a little bit of the need for control and what it meant. Maybe somebody could say, "You must have been in a lot of pain. Would you want to talk about it? Is it something I could ask about, or would you rather not talk about it?" Throughout the rest of his narrative, Mashuk demonstrates a desire for increased access intimacy in which more people ask each other about psychological pain openly. And this is kind of a microcosm of queer world making and action. The last narrator that I'll share with you today is Naomi Provins, who describes access intimacy in the form of a care web. She said, "I have an entire household of people who are devoted to the protection of everyone else in that household. When I get those suicidal feelings and they're overwhelming, I can talk about them instead of just them being brushed under the table or hidden from everyone else. Instead of the usual, 'Don't do it, we care about you,' they ask why I feel like that or why I want to, and it gives me the chance to answer them when no one else did that before." Naomi doesn't use the term, but what she describes is essentially a care web alternative to inpatient psych care. Similar 24-hour support is provided, but the violence of all of the carceral aspects of care are avoided. And throughout her story, she demonstrates that her household offers the kind of purposeful, communicative, mutual attunement that's required for access intimacy to take place. Now, you might be hearing all this and saying, yeah, that's great, but it's not that easy. Yes, this whole thing is incredibly messy. queer sounds fantastic, and the notion of care webs as these perfect non-carceral abuse-free alternatives to psychiatry is of course very utopian, because when people with different abilities and identities come together, we have to address hierarchy and power. We also know that disabled, mad, suicidal people receiving at-home care are frequently victims of abuse and are often much less able to escape these situations if they depend on their abusers for survival. We also know that these are people who often are low income and are facing housing insecurity. So this is a situation where we have a high possibility of encountering abuse. Even when it's an ideal situation where everyone in this queer vivation care web is loving and reflexive, we still have to address power. There's a Vancouver-based disability group called, I forget what it stands for, but the acronym is RAMP. And they delve into this issue with a bunch of questions like, what does it mean when I can't support you in the ways you're supporting me? Does interdependency mean we have to do the same things for one another at all times? Is there even such thing as the same thing? Is it a gentle ebb and flow? What if I never am able to match your flow? What if there's a torrential rainpour and one of us is drowning? What do we do? And these questions can't be ignored. The concept of a care web can't be idealized to erase these things. When we're talking about suicide care, this might involve screaming, crying, blood, vomit, firearms, syringes, pills, blades, ledges. We can't romanticize all of this to the point of erasing those dark sides. And I think that it's really easy for us to oversimplify care work because of the fact that our cultures devalue the people who do most care labor in the first place, which is low-income women of color. There are tons of questions to be raised about the utility of queer vivation and what I'm talking about. And this does not reduce the value of these conversations, though. Just because we need to critique something doesn't mean it needs to go away. So while attending to all of these complex relationships, I think that future work on queering the desire to die can help us understand suicidality not just as an internal deficit, but as an understandable response to living in societies that are rife with the violences of normativity. And if we name and see compulsory vivation for what it is, which is a system of power based on isolation and naming and violence, that opens up one path towards survival through queer vivation. And through this, we can help people live well with the desire to die because we can create and support care systems in which people aren't prevented from killing themselves via force, but are rather invited to continue living in more habitable worlds that we build together. So since publishing this article in 2022, I've continued working on lots of other projects aimed at challenging the violences of compulsory vivation. The biggest target of that has been 988, which is the United States recently revamped national crisis hotline. Since the rollout of 988 in 2022, the federal government in the US has invested almost $1.5 billion into suicide prevention and crisis response. But to get that funding, policy explicitly states that hotlines have to agree to call police in situations of imminent risk. We know that this practice reduces the number of people who are willing to call hotlines. It's dangerous for callers and it produces high levels of trauma. And as we talked about, it doesn't actually reduce suicide. To the contrary, it increases the risk of suicide pretty significantly. So I recently co-published, I'm one of many, many authors. I want to be clear, I am not the writer of this, one of many, co-publishing this 108-page report that's publicly available through the organization Trans Lifeline that addresses a lot of these issues with 988. This report was a huge collaboration with academics, community researchers, and backgrounds in social justice, organizing, crisis response, surviving psychiatric hospitalization, and suicidality. And we designed a mixed method study to help better understand help seekers' crisis experiences. We centered marginalized groups through that. You can see the participant demographics there are quite diverse. And ultimately, we analyzed all of this data, qual and quant data, and used it to produce this report that outlines our findings and then provides some concrete recommendations for policy revisions surrounding crisis hotlines in the US. all of these recommendations are aimed at decreasing the impacts of what I'm calling compulsory probation. That term is not used in the report. Often we just call it carceral care, but it's all addressing the same broader issue. So that's all I have for you today. I'm thrilled to hear your questions, but I want to leave with one final statement to kind of stir you all up. And that is that the current mainstream systems for addressing suicide are broken. They don't work. And they actually make things worse for a lot of suicidal people. But I think that organizations and medical professionals are only sticking to these systems because they're scared that people might die if we do something different. And they might, and they will. But people are dying now too. So we have to have the courage to try something else. We can do better, and critical community engaged research can help us get there. Thank you for listening.
I think if we were in one of those like crusty academic rooms at the University of Toronto right now, you would hear a roaring applause, Professor Krebs. So thank you so much. I'm seeing all the lovely heart emojis, and I'm just gonna just make a quick change to the view here.
Perfect.
Okay. Well, we have a wonderful amount of students and colleagues who are here today. There's about 17 folks who are still in the room who've enjoyed this incredible presentation. I just want to mention I put in the 988 report, the problem with 988 report, as a link in the chat. And there's also a link to the DOI for Queering the Desire to Die. That's in the Journal of Homosexuality, I believe. But if
Yes.
you follow Dr. Krebs on Google Scholar, you could find a wonderful array of articles. I've been back channeling a little bit and mentioned to one of my colleagues that we both have like read literally every page of your dissertation now multiple times. So
No.
it's really delightful, and I'm so grateful for this. I have so many thoughts and questions and reflections, but most of what I feel right now is just incredible gratitude. I think yeah, you've done just a brilliant job at framing some of the key concepts we need to be working with, but also doing this important threading towards the way that these concepts might actually really help us to think differently about practice, and moreover, the ethical stakes of failing to do so. So I'm just deeply appreciative of that. And I'm going to just yeah, I've got a number of questions I'm ready to offer, but I'm going to actually begin by just turning to some students and folks who are here. If I have one colleague who has to leave a little early, so I'm going to ask Nicole, if you have any questions, you're welcome to ask now. And if not, I'll take it to whoever's next in the chat.
I'm dropping my email there as well. So if anyone wants to reach out after and you don't have time, feel free to do so. I love getting messages from people who are doing this kind of work.
Okay. So I'm going to start with this first anonymous attendee. Do you have any ideas about how therapists can incorporate some of these ideas into their work? Or is there only so much that can be done in this kind of inherently hierarchical structure? This is a fantastic question. And also I want to provoke some of the students that I supervise who I know are here to reflect on this question as well, so that you can also chime in on this. So if any of my students are here, I'm going to give you the opportunity to talk if you'd like to respond to that a little bit. But Dr. Krebs, what are your initial thoughts?
Don't put people in involuntary care. That's my initial thought. You can offer a lot of support for people as a therapist. I know that there are ethical and legal commitments to engaging with involuntary care, but there are a lot of therapists that don't do it. If you look at Project Let's, LETS in all caps, they have a list of providers who refuse to engage in carceral care practices. So that is one way that I will offer. But I'd love to hear from folks who are studying that realm.
Yeah, if any of my students are here that just like want to chime in on that, I'm not sure what we can do so that you can notify me. But if you just want to I'm gonna maybe just allow Nicole to talk in response to that if you want. Also, I've got, let's see, Brandon on here, and I've got Rachel and Shannon on here. But I'm curious, none of you have to, but you're welcome to if you'd like to join in.
Hi, can folks hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you, Nicole.
Oh, thanks. I'm so glad to be here, Dr. Krebs. I'm one of the folks who read your thesis front to back.
I'm
Um,
sorry.
no, it was so helpful. I also recently finished my dissertation. Um, I just loved your concept of compulsory Vyvanse, and I guess I just wanted to comment that I think it has a lot of utility in practice and um, actually with some of the education that I've done previously in social work, I think it really influences how I consent folks to therapy and when going through the limits of confidentiality, actually speaking about expectations of care. And um, I think sometimes it can feel a bit limiting in terms of really naming with folks what the different third-party reporting options look like and how it might play out in person. But I think it gives a lot of agency to kind of, explain like, if we do option B, which results in this outcome, um, does that feel like that kind of meets your needs and what you're looking for? And so, that's not doing third-party reporting or working with folks who might need an elevated level of care, but I just found um, yeah, some of the language that you gave me like a lot of um, just means to kind of like be in the darkness with folks in a way that helps them choose what might be most supportive for them. So it's not really a question, but yeah, I just so appreciate what your work kind of means for like consenting processes. It's given me a lot to think about.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. Any others here who want to chime in from the lab? And then we'll head back to the questions here. Okay, fair. I did put you on the spot. No pressure. Um, I see a question from Behan. And if you would like, Behan, you can ask the question out loud here or share your thoughts here if you'd like.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Awesome. I am on in transit, but can talk comfortably. So I first of all, thank you so much. It's helping me really think through some core questions in my own work, and I am currently focusing on ed tech surveillance. So the ways that particular software will monitor student communication and they rationalize it in order to sort of prevent bullying, self-harm, suicide. And I even spoke to someone who was like developing the software, and I've been really thinking about how to respond to those that kind of rhetoric in ways that is going to achieve the aim of doing otherwise, because I think of the policies that you're referencing and the ways that particular companies are selling these solutions and the ways that it's sort of taking up space in public education in particular.
Yes, I'm not an expert on ed tech and those specific entities, but I am fascinated because they're very much part of this overarching surveillance, essentially, of anyone that could possibly be at suicide risk, which is very much part of compulsory vivation. This concept of see something, say something. It's like we're all cops now. And now we have robots that are cops to find these people via whatever algorithms are trying to detect this risk. I think to me, to kind of address this and a couple other questions in the chat that are asking about concrete policy changes, the biggest ones that are in the 988 report and are also coming to mind that would relate to this. The first one is that we need to prioritize policies and practices that are based on informed consent, transparency, and accountability to the needs of people who are receiving care or who might need help. Because a lot of this comes in this kind of problematic arena of we're doing things behind people's backs and they don't know, but it's all for them, so it's okay. Which I think Nicole was mentioning, more of this informed consent type of thing, or transparency about what might happen if you get flagged by one of these systems. And I think that that would be really, really helpful. To answer some of the other questions about concrete policy changes, with 988 in particular, a really simple one would be to remove the stipulation that in order to get federal funding, a hotline has to use the police, because there are lots of hotlines that don't, but they really struggle because they don't have much funding. So, for example, Trans Lifeline is one of them that refuses to engage with police unless a caller explicitly asks for intervention to be taken hold. They will never do it without consent. And they can't get federal funding because of that choice. So changing policies that restrict funding is a major part of this. We also talked about putting more investment financially into non-punitive crisis care. So making sure that systems, not just hotlines, but other systems like your support entities and mobile crisis units that don't involve carceral care get funding, just like the ones that do have all of these harmful practices.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you for that, because I think that's so relevant to our context in particular in Canada right now, because as you probably are aware, we've recently in the last 2 years launched a new 988 similar kind of system. And yeah, there are a lot of considerations around its implementation, lots of things to be learned from the United States' implementation as well. And these are really good examples, I think, of concrete issues. But I also think the questions about, we are looking for something concrete that is ultimately about something that is like deeply resistant to oversimplified structural responses to. So it's a very tough balance. I think that probably answered Luke's question in particular, as well as Ashley's, but I want to just maybe make a moment to follow up on a question from George. If you don't mind just putting a question into the chat, George, and then I'll review it. And then I'm going to ask for James, actually, if you want to ask your question online. James, you're welcome to speak. I'll open that up now if you'd like.
Hi there. Hopefully you can all hear me.
We can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you again, Dr. Krebs, for your lecture, and excited to get to know your work and hopefully see more of it in the future. I was hoping just to get your perspective on the, I think what you were calling the care web approach to this sort of queer suicidality care, which you were suggesting as a path forward. I was reminded as you were speaking of a book I was recently reading by the Australian sociologist Melinda Cooper. It's called Family Values. Highly recommend to everyone. Overall, it's an analysis of the neoliberal turn in America, but one chapter specifically focuses on healthcare during the AIDS crisis during Ronald Reagan's administration. So one thing that, of course, happened during this period was that there was no public health care, or very little available to the queer people who were, of course, disproportionately being affected by illness and dying as a result of AIDS. And what happened was that all these sorts of impromptu pop-up care networks run by queer people themselves, came up as a way to supplement the care that was missing, to kind of pull together to provide what wasn't being provided by the state, and so on, which I think is an example of something along the lines of what you mean.
Yes.
And why I raised the question in the book is that while Belinda Cooper obviously also praises the resilience of queer people during this crisis and being able to provide this healthcare for themselves within themselves, she also really interestingly shows evidence that this turn towards the establishment of these private, like outside of the state healthcare networks, was tacitly supported by the neoliberal administration itself, because it meant that healthcare indeed was being provided without the provision of public funding. And in her book, she's very cautionary about the kind of agreement between, neoliberal state policies with the establishment of these informal, private, or charity-based networks, since both of them do turn away from the reform of public funding and policy. And I'm wondering about your perspective about how you would balance the need for calls to turn to more private network-based care, but also with the calls to reform of state-based healthcare, or whether you find that necessary at all.
Thanks,
Yeah,
James.
this is a really good question. Um, I would love to read this book. I'm going to look for it. And I think that part of my answer is that it's not an either or, it's a both and situation. So in my mind, care webs are not designed to replace having better state systems of care, better publicly funded care for people who are experiencing suicide crises. It's something that can happen alongside that. And we kind of have in disability justice and mad justice and other justice systems, these two kind of models where we've got the radical model, which says the system is broken, burn it down and start from scratch. And the other more liberal model that says, let me kind of revise what we have and reform it, because that's how we're going to get things done. And I think my work is trying to do both. So the care webs concept in this presentation and in this article is very much that radical outside the system, which that is an interesting proposition, that indeed that supports the system because we don't have to fund better care. People are just going to do it themselves. And I think that we can use that while also calling for reforms so that this type of queer care web is supported in mainstream healthcare and given funding. And so I have this kind of radical writing and presentation that I gave today. And then when we look at, for instance, the report about 988, we see a lot more of that. Okay, we can't just do this all ourselves. And yes, care webs are beautiful and wonderful, but they're band-aids on a broken system. So we need also systemic support. So to me, well, I think that's a really good critique, and I'll definitely read that book. I think it's a both and, as opposed to an either or, if that makes sense.
That's really, I think that's a perspective that I think I share, Dr. Krebs, because I think there is like a way in which our failure to think about theories of change in complex systems ends up resulting ultimately in the negation of responsibility of those systems. And I see that happening constantly, in particular in the context of First Nations communities, where there has been such a profound abandonment of the state in these systems that people are left with no other options than the formation of informal networks and so forth. But if we completely abandon like the advocacy and pressure and accountability against the state in its failing, materially, we're also like made more vulnerable. So it's a really, I think it's quite a bind. And I think that because of that, this emphasis on insisting like simultaneous action on multiple fronts is really, I think, really clearly beneficial. There's a few other questions, but I'm going to throw in a couple at you if you're interested for a few more minutes. Do you have a few more minutes of time?
I've got like 2 or 3 more minutes, and then I got to run to teach.
Okay, well, maybe I'll ask this as a final question then. You had a comment where you were talking about a second feature is about that experiential knowledge and witnessing pain. And so much of the work of psychotherapists is about that work, sitting with people, having conversations, and hopefully the kind of psychotherapists we want people to see are the ones that are actually like interested in and able to sit with that complexity of pain. There's a lot of research, particularly in communication, the media studies around the ways in which people talk about suicide in public, being hotly surveilled. I mean, we've probably felt it even in your writing. I certainly feel it in mine that there are certain ways of talking about suicide that are like regulated. Whether we're talking about like the Werther effect or whether we're talking about media, the way it portrays certain topics. How do you speak back to, and how would you trouble the kind of anxiety that emerges among suicide researchers around what it means to invite a more fulsome witnessing and experiential knowledge of the desire to die, because it's so often tightly regulated? I'm just curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I wrote a paper about 13 Reasons Why, the TV show that kind of goes into this more, but we don't actually have a lot of evidence behind these claims that talking about suicide makes people die by suicide. It's kind of, to me, part of that compulsory evasion is that we just shuttle the conversations down. We're not going to talk about these things. But for me, I have found in my own research and teaching that actually people really, really, really want to be able to talk about this stuff freely. And yes, that does make some people uncomfortable, and it's not always good for other people to hear these things if they're not in a space where they can do it. But my resistance factor has been saying, okay, well, not talking about suicide or only talking about it in these cautious ways is actually not fixing things. So maybe we can try something else. I think that a lot of the kind of restrictions around thinking and talking about suicide are based on fear of risk that doesn't engage with the risk of things staying the same, if that makes sense.
Totally. Well, Dr. Krebs, thank you so much for your time today. I wish you and your students the best of classes, and I appreciate the glyph of resistance on your wall behind you, and I'm grateful for your solidarity in this work, and with sincere appreciation for your time today. I'll just say that for those of you who wish to remain in the conversation and debrief and talk further, I'll be staying online for another 15 minutes and happy to discuss and further discuss any questions that people have, but I'll stop the recording now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and feel free to reach out via email. Thanks so much for having me.
Take good care.